General Cartwright, I first worked very closely with him and for him when he was working in the J8 on the Joint Staff, and first as the Deputy Director for Resources and Acquisition, and later as the Director J8. He really lived at the intersection of warfare requirements and resources. After being Director J8, he went out to Stratcom, and in that position, he pushed very hard for an improved global approach to cyber execution and cyber policy. Later, as the Vice Chairman, his last job on active duty, he pushed the entire Department of Defense, and indeed, I would offer the national leadership in this area. You know, when it's one thing for people who are communicators, people who are working in the business close to cyber pursuits, to push the importance of cyber. But it's another thing altogether for the Marine fighter pilot who went to OCS, who's now the Vice Chairman, to say, it's time. And he did just that. And nobody moved the Department of Defense more on this hugely important issue. So it's my honor today to introduce General Cartwright, former Vice Chairman and holder of the Harold E. Brown Chair at CSIS. General Cartwright.
Thank you. As I got up, I fell apart. So we'll see if we can get put back together again here. Now I'm dressed. I appreciate the opportunity. Quite frankly, I was trying to figure out exactly what it was that they wanted from me in this speech, because it said history and it said future and it said cyber, and so I was kind of, okay, which direction you want to go? Most every airplane I ever flew is on a pole someplace, so I've got a little bit of the history side of the equation. And for me, a lot of this comes down to strategy and concepts and how you want to think about warfare and whatnot. And so what I'm not going to talk about today is defending your computer, you know, your desktop. I'm not going to talk about intellectual capital that's being stolen around the country and all that stuff. I'm going to talk about warfare and Title 10 and cyber. And there's all sorts of other stuff going on out there, but I will walk you through a little bit of the history of why we are where we are, a little bit of where we are today, and a little bit of what I see towards the future in this particular venue. Whenever you talk about strategy, I always tend to go back. I remember this story that when I was in Nebraska, you know, doing my sentence out in Omaha, I met Warren Buffett, and we had a couple of interchanges. The very first day that they had the change of command, he came up to me and he said, "I don't like this thing nuclear, but I'll support you whatever you need. Just tell me what you need." Okay, that's a nice start. Next time we had lunch together, and he started telling me about strategy, and he said, "You know, I had a conversation, and I was explaining to Mike Tyson financial strategies and where we were going and how to think about financial strategies." And he said, Mike turned to me and said, that's nice, Warren. However, for me, strategy is, as soon as he opens his mouth, I hit him as hard as I can." It's a different strategy, but it works. We're going to try to straddle the in-between of that today as we discuss this. But in 2004, which is not the beginning of cyber by any stretch of the imagination, but for the Department of Defense, when I arrived at Stratcom, we added 5 new missions, one of them being cyber. And so for me, that was the first official tasking. That was the stand-up of Cyber Command, the cyber responsibilities, putting them on the operational side of the fence. And so we started to work our way through that. But what I'd like to do today is talk to you just from the standpoint of, okay, what was the vision? What was in my head? Doesn't make it right, but just to give you some context of how I was thinking about cyber. And then what did we do as a result of that at Stratcom to set us on the path that we're on, kind of where that path has taken us and where I hope it'll take us in the future. At the time, recall the debate that was going on was one of, you know, all of the Beltway bandits were making their money by selling soft power. We had more conferences about soft power and whole of government and all of those types of concepts than you could shake a stick at, and people were getting rich over those things, although not a lot was happening, quite frankly. So in that context, a little bit of what we were trying to do with these new mission areas, in particular cyber, was to look at the continuum that starts with diplomacy. And then to the extent that diplomacy has and uses all of the tools at its beck and call, when diplomacy starts to run out, when the case for diplomacy has hit a wall, then we use military force most of the time to reset the diplomacy activity. Military force should support that diplomacy when you go into conflict, and it should support that diplomacy coming out, because no war ends by war, it ends by diplomacy. Okay, that's just the basics of it. And for us, and from my perspective, there was a large gap between what you could do with sanctions and the transition to military power. And the tools available to a president or a nation in between diplomacy and military power were not terribly effective. Okay? And so, from my perspective, at that time, what I was looking for was a set of tools that had broad range of capability, had no regard really for strategic depth, and could be used in a way that would make a more logical transition, may even avoid the use of kinetic force to reset diplomacy and reestablish the ability to negotiate with whoever you're working with. Okay? So we were looking for a way to fill that gap. And from my perspective, the areas in technology that I was looking at were electromagnetic pulse, directed energy, electronic warfare, and cyber. All speed of light, all wide range of capabilities from influence all the way to destruction, could be applied, you could manage escalation with it, and you could extend the life of diplomatic activities at the non-kinetic level. Okay? And if you needed to make a transition into kinetic, they could be integrated into kinetic as fires. And so the idea was that these areas would become those capabilities. At the same time, take you just a little bit further back, in the attributes of being able to take the fight basically to the enemy at the time and place of your choosing, earlier than Vietnam, but for me in Vietnam, we basically took the idea of weather inhibiting the fight away. Radar allowed us to see through the weather. Okay? Fast forward into the Gulf War, we basically took the night away with imaging capabilities both in the low light and the IR spectrums to be able to carry the fight to the adversary day, night, all weather. And that's kind of where we ended up at the first Gulf War. The areas that I told the Secretary at that time that I wanted to be able to start to take on after that was mobility and strategic depth. Because most of the problems and challenges we had for survivability of the adversary were his ability to move, hide, do things like that. And the depth that we would have with a large nation, you pick the one in the continent, but long strategic depth, but also no strategic depth, which is equally difficult for us. Deep strategic depth means that you spend lots of money, and today the things that we have that go deep strategic depth are ICBMs loaded with nuclear weapons. Not a particularly good choice to start with. But the other side of that equation is the rocket that takes about 7 seconds to go from point A to point B, because the rest of the world is not guarded by oceans. Okay? And we need to be able to work at no strategic depth and very large strategic depth. And speed of light weapons were well suited for those kinds of problems. And that was really at the heart of what we were trying to get accomplished. Okay? As we worked our way through this, I had a partner in this by the name of Mike Hayden, who was at the time the head of the National Security Agency. And together we sat for quite a while trying to work our way through, okay, how should we do this? How do we organize for this? How do we stay inside the boundaries of law and policy and start to move this forward? And we both agreed that the National Security Agency was the nexus of what potentially would be the skills necessary to create a cyber force. Mathematicians, cryptologists were kind of at the heart of that, and the idea of signals intelligence. Those three things tended to be the nexus of where you wanted to be if you wanted to develop cyber capabilities. So we took what was called at that time and is today a combat support agency. In other words, an agency that is both DOD and the intelligence community, fondly called Title 50 and Title 10. We put the two of them together. That was already done in law. Made the commander of NSA the commander of the functional component for cyber under strategic command. Key in that decision was that we put, at least from my perspective, the deputy commander was a combat arms person, okay? Because I asked the Institute for Defense Analysis to go do some work for me about standing up commands and how you might do that. And quite frankly, what they came back and told me was, one, don't stand them up by phenomenology. Space command did not work in their mind. I mean, it's not anything bad about space, but the idea of standing up a domain as a command did not work. And they had a couple other examples. The second was, make sure that when you stand it up, don't stand it up only at the strategic level, because the perspective that they have will be fundamentally disconnected from the perspective that a warfighter will have in the field, okay? And so this is where we really pushed hard by putting a deputy in for combat arms, that in DOD, cyber is fires. It is fires. You find its integration, you work its integration, you do the business as if it is fires, okay? It is not a special section, walled off behind a bunch of green doors and whatnot. Lance Corporal Cartwright ought to be able at the tactical level to ask for cyber fires and know what to expect and know how to expect to get them and how to use them. They should not be hidden, okay? That was the thrust of what the Institute for Defense Analysis came back to us with, and that was the direction that we headed. And why we have pushed very hard and to this day maintain a combat arms deputy in that activity. Now, they're moving off in a different direction to become a unified command, which I have some worry about because that violates one of the precepts, which is don't make this thing only strategic, okay? But that was the reasoning behind the activity. And at that time, we pushed off and we stood it up out at Fort Meade, and we stood the component up and we started working our way through how to do this. Much of the work that we have done, unfortunately, you know, it is what it is, was hijacked. It was hijacked by the internet, okay? Everybody sees cyber as the internet. Cyber is about your desktop computers. Cyber is about, you know, who's stealing the intellectual capital or denying your web page or whatever it is, okay? That's not where we intended to go. Now, it may be where we'll end up going, and that's fine. But our intent, at least from my perspective, was back to what we were trying to solve, which is that this is fires. We don't build pure defenses, and we certainly in the Department of Defense try not to build point defenses. In other words, at your desktop terminal, at the end point, a firewall and virus protection is a point defense. No historical precedent for that ever being successful in battle, okay? You don't impose any cost in the adversary that way. In fact, you actually make a hugely wonderful business case for the adversary. And most of you have heard these stories that we've used before, but it's a couple hundred lines of code to write a virus. McAfee uses a couple million lines of code to patch. It's a great business case, okay? But it will never take you. It's a cost-imposing strategy on us to do business that way. DOD's in the business for offense, all right? That's essentially what we are. We do defense of our networks from the standpoint to ensure that they're resilient and they're available to us when we need them, okay? but that is secondary to the ability to conduct fires in our mission. And so that is the perspective from my side of the house of what I was trying to carry forward into the department as we worked our way through. And to this day, and to the recent speeches here the last few days, we're still trying to decide how to protect everybody's desktop computers and storage devices, and not thinking a lot about what it is we intended to get out of cyber. And it may end up being that way, and so be it. But from my perspective, that's really not where the leverage is, and there's no good historical precedent for taking that route, okay? Most of that should be law enforcement. We also set out at that time, between Mike Hayden and then when Keith Alexander came in, to fundamentally separate the Department of Defense's networks in protection capabilities from the general grid. Okay, not physically separate, fundamentally separate how we defend. Okay, and eventually to architect that next network, which is what we're in the process of doing today, so that it is fundamentally different than the internet, fundamentally differently protected, and architected from the ground up, basically from metal, which is the baseline of the chip, all the way through the networks. Okay, that is the intent, that was the intent. That is the way we are architected in the copper environment, so to speak, and that's the way we intended to move in the fiber environment as well as the wireless environment. DoD and offensive cyber is 90% about the wireless world, not about the wired world. Most of what goes on in the wired world is associated with the intelligence community. You know, what's in your directory? What do you have there? What's your intent? How do you do operational preparation of the battle space? All of those activities generally are occurring in the wired world. We live in the wireless world. The world is moving on the commercial sector to the wireless world. Okay? But that's where we do business. Take it from a Marine fighter pilot here. So this is kind of cyber for dummies because it's the only way I can do it. But from my perspective, cyber is about taking a waveform in the electromagnetic spectrum, any waveform, and coding on it a vehicle that transports you to where you want to go, okay, and putting on the back of that a payload that does whatever it is you want to have done, okay? So we have multiple apertures out there that we use to take in information. You remember, and this is how I kind of think about it, and I can look around the room, and most of you remember that radios that you dialed in the frequency and then you found it. Basically what you're doing is excluding all frequencies. You're not finding one, you're excluding all frequencies. You know, we have Kalman filters and things like that today that basically do this in a digital format, et cetera. So from my perspective, and this is where I'm thinking, what our intent is in the cyber domain is that any aperture, any military aperture out there that is consistent with the law of armed conflict is a valid target for the military. We don't go after people, we don't go after businesses, we don't go after infrastructure associated with keeping a country running and taking care of the people. I mean, we have a set of valid military targets. Almost all of them today in any country, no matter how forward or retro that you look at, has apertures associated with their weapons, okay? And the nexus here between electronic warfare, which we have not tried to sort out yet, but we have just community biases and wars going on other than that. The nexus here is you use electronic warfare to open those apertures. We have for years, okay? And then you basically go in through that waveform and you do what you want to do. Fundamentally, again, electronic warfare for dummies for me, what I do in electronic warfare is if you're sitting there and you're the bad guy and I'm sitting here and I'm the good guy, basically what I'm trying to do is make you believe I'm over there while I'm here. Okay, I may steal a range gate, I may steal an angular displacement, I may do barrage noise and hide in it, any number of the techniques that have served us for years and years in electronic warfare. But I go in, I open up that aperture, and then I do that kind of work. The fundamental difference with cyber is now I make you believe that I'm someplace, and I physically actually go someplace else. I take you someplace and make you believe you're not where you are. So as the adversary, you think you're over the target, you're actually over home base, or whatever it is you want to do to deceive them. So it's a fundamental difference in philosophy. The two are going to merge. There's no doubt in my mind. It's just we got to get through the cultural exchange right now. And you'll see the hackers and the EW guys that are not getting along all that well yet. But we'll find a way to figure that out. But at the end of the day, that's the theory of the case, okay? And you can do any number of things from just offsetting something by making a buffer overflow to taking control, okay? And creating your own realities in a virtual world. And that's what cyber is. And the fact that it can do it at multiple levels, across multiple venues, with any number of requirements and restrictions put on it, makes it very tailorable to what it is you want to be able to do. As we worked our way through this in Cyber Command at that time in Stratcom, the other venues, directed energy and electromagnetic pulse, also moved along at about the same pace, quite frankly. And they are very valid ways of doing business as you start to work your way through and refine them. All of these have huge questions from the standpoint of collateral damage, okay? Okay? Those rules don't get relaxed because it's a new way of doing business. In fact, if anything, they become more strict. And so as you look at this today, the collateral damage issue, what has become apparent to us anyway, or let me say apparent to me, is that, in fact, you can manage collateral damage. It's not perfect, but it's probably far better than a lot of the kinetic fires that we have today, okay? And I go back and kind of pick this up, this theme. For us in the department, organizational construct, okay? First, services, and we went through a little bit of a struggle with this. Services are there to train and equip, okay? I turn to a service and I expect a service to build and create capabilities in their domain, okay? As does the Congress, as does the National Command Authority. And if you try to do something other than that, they will slap your hand, okay? So if the Army tries to build cyber capabilities for anti-air, air-to-air, they're not going to get the money. The Congress won't approve it, okay? So you expect the services to do that. For a while there was maybe we ought to let the Air Force just run all of cyber. To me, that makes no sense. That takes away the operational and strategic levels of war for all the other services. You've got to have them in the game. They're the ones that are resourced. This is their job. This is their responsibility to raise a force, train that force, equip that force, and present it to combatant commanders. Combatant commanders, when they receive those forces, operate at 3 different levels. The strategic, which is basically intercontinental. One of the big issues that we are working our way through, and I think we're generally finding our way as I read the press today at the strategic level, is just like kinetic or physical beings, you cannot pass through a third party's country without their permission. You can say all the things you want about, well, I didn't really touch anything and I didn't really do it. It doesn't matter. The law is the law. You cannot go into those physical entities like servers in another country without their permission. It's just the way it is. Doesn't mean that people don't do it, but that's the law, okay? You can go up to space and come back down again, which is generally the way we would try to do business, but you cannot pass through a third party without doing that. Operational happens to be, those are the regional combatant commanders. Inside their region, they can move around, but again, they cannot pass through a third party without their permission, okay? And they conduct fires, and those fires must remain inside that region, must remain inside when they're conducting fires, a declared area of hostility. That's the law, okay? At the tactical level, that's on the battlefield. That is inside the area of hostility, and their fires must remain inside the area of hostility. That's the law, okay? And you say, well, how can you do that in cyber? It's actually pretty simple. I mean, it's pretty simple to say that You know, I want to go to your display in your cockpit and affect it, just like electronic warfare. Okay? Most of what we deal with in warfare is closed networks. That's just the reality of it. Okay? You must maintain those three levels. If we try to do everything from a strategic perspective, the guy at the tactical end and the guy at the operational end are going to be very uncomfortable. Regional combatant commanders are responsible for coordinating fires inside an area of hostility and inside their AOR. Having a third party from the outside come in and do that takes away the coordination, takes away the integration of fires, takes away the intent of maneuver. You lose all of those aspects. You do not want to go purely strategic in this environment. That's my opinion. People may have a different idea about that, but that's the way I see it. Okay? As I look towards the future in this venue, and Admiral Daly didn't say it, but I'm going to do this for about another 5 minutes, and then we're going to reverse it. I've told you about everything I know, and then you can ask questions, and we'll go any direction you want to go. But as I look towards the future in this area, what I'm seeing now, as I live more in the civil sector than I do in the military sector, but associated with national security organizations, et cetera, you know, we are, in fact, starting to architect in a fundamentally different way within the department for resiliency, for the ability to conduct fires, to sustain those fires when we are under attack and under duress, and starting to move in that direction. Never be satisfied with how fast that's moving or how good it is, okay? We're also starting to adapt to the fact that we live in a digital world. War fights don't move at the speed of 20-year patent law. I mean, it just plain doesn't work. It doesn't move at the speed of 5-year PPBS. Okay? If we hadn't had supplementals in these last contexts, in these last conflicts, I'm not sure how I would have, as the vice chairman, been able to keep some sort of competitive edge on the battlefield. On the battlefield today, the IED fight turns about every 30 days. You come up with a fuse, we come up with a counter, you come up with a new fuse, every 30 days. I cannot afford to build a new vehicle each time that happens, especially with 15 years of development time asked for the next version of the truck that we're going to put out in the Army. The cyber fight, as it exists today at the tactical level, turns about every 9 to 14 days. That's the periodicity of how quickly it turns. So you have to be organized, and you have to have architectures that can accommodate that kind of a battle rhythm. Okay? And those are not normally hardware driven. Okay? There is a hardware component to it. We're not getting out of the business of hardware, but capabilities that are platform agnostic, including in cyber, are critical to us. Because today you build a jet plane, you build a ship, you build whatever it is, it takes you 10 or 15 years to build it for a war that you're imagining may happen in the future, for a need that and an adversary that you're imagining you may have run into in the future. And the one thing that we've been perfect at is guessing wrong. Okay? So you arrive at a conflict, and now you need to be modified. And our modification processes take us months and years, not days and weeks. And we've got to move to days and weeks because that's the reality of the battlefield that we find ourselves on today. Cyber is going to be a critical part of that. The ability to create cyber capabilities and those kinds of timelines is critical to us. People have asked me, oh my gosh, if you use something like this, then everybody will know, and it'll be no good, and it'll take you, 2 or 3 years to build the next one. We have rifles and bullets. People have known that for a long time. That doesn't stop us from going to conflict, and it doesn't stop us from being able to do what we need to do. That's not the way you do business on the offensive side of the equation. So these weapons are in fact persistent, and they are able to sustain over extended periods of time, okay? And they impose significant cost on an adversary. I mean, you pick a circuit board that is in an entire fleet, a circuit board that's in multiple fleets in multiple domains. If that circuit board is rendered useless, you've imposed a significant cost on your adversary that it will take much more than days and weeks to fix. Okay? Same is true for us. What we're learning, and what I've seen thus far, both in the commercial sector and in the government sector, is that As you start to understand and think about offense, this is no surprise to anybody that's been in the military, you have a much better appreciation for what it is you really need in defenses. And you can focus your investments much more accurately than we do without having a good offensive mindset. I think a big step for the country was taken here in a positive direction when I was the vice chairman. I directed, depends on how you see it, but from my perspective, I asked, go out and DARPA and hire me at least a half a dozen of the best hackers in the world and bring them in and let us understand what it is they do, what's their trade craft, how do they think about problems, et cetera. And quite frankly, we learned from them, but we also brought a lot of knowledge on our own to that game. I see this week there's public announcement that they will hold a conference with industry to start talking about offensive cyber and how to think about offensive cyber and how we'll pursue offensive cyber. You put that together with a lot of the R&D that's being done in industry on the offensive and defensive side, and you start to see an architecture taking place inside the department that will certainly serve us well. The difficult part for us is the legacy systems and how we're going to handle the legacy systems. But from my perspective right now, we're on a good footing. I understand you're going to have one of those gents here later today. You know, as I've certainly spent time working with the services when I was on active duty, trying to figure out, okay, if I see one of these cyber people walking down the street, exactly what is the demographic I'm looking at or looking for? And when Mike Hayden and I kind of started working our way through this, we had 6 Jedi Knights, you know, that we thought were the best and the brightest that had bubbled up. And there was no demographic there. I mean, there was anywhere from 19 to just short of 60. All ranks, all educational backgrounds, it didn't really matter. Ponytails and ponytail was not gender specific. But that has not changed, and quite frankly, the services are trying to sort through this. What is the demographic we're looking for? And like every new area, we automatically go, oh, we won't be able to bring them in and assimilate them into the service. It'll never work. We'll have to pay them differently. We'll have to have different kind of service. We'll have to have warrant officers or something like that will be fundamentally different because this just won't work. And best I can tell right now, as usual, we're wrong about that. You know, there is a mindset and an understanding and a pattern of growth and education and how you grow up in this area that makes you very comfortable in this environment. And we're having no problem recruiting people that want to do this. Our biggest problem, like it always is in new technologies, is retaining them, not finding them. And that has proved out. The schools have adapted. You heard the superintendent talking about what we're doing here at the academy, but we're seeing that all over the academic industry, all the colleges, et cetera. And so we're having no problem recruiting to this field, none whatsoever. Our biggest problem is right now for most of the services, you're talking about 1 to 2 years of waiting time to get in and get started in this. And industry is just standing there at the 5th year or whatever after you've finished your schools and your requirements. How would you like to come work for us? Now, engineers are really important in this area, but they're not the be-all, end-all as we've learned over time. So the idea, the thought process, how do you cover strategic depth? How do you get at mobility? How do you find something, a set of tools for the National Command Authority that bridges what was a gulf between diplomacy and kinetic fires? The idea that you can do this and be dealing with weapons that you can turn in days and weeks, modify, customize, manage collateral damage, have effects that are on time and can be integrated with other fires, not just random and happen when they happen. All of those are the attributes that we sought in this environment. All of those, for the most part, appear to be moving along. I still believe that in Department of Defense, we are far too focused on defending. Now, you and I both know in the Department of Defense, the word defense versus offense has different meanings depending on who you're talking to. But right now, dollars and cents, way too much of the percentage is going to defending the networks that are mostly headquarters and administrative and logistic in nature. Doesn't mean that we don't want to do it. And far too little of the investment is moving towards fires. And we've got to shift that. That's not a popular opinion out there. Particularly, I spent yesterday up at University of Pennsylvania with lawyers all day working through cyber issues. That was fun. But quite frankly, they do see it the same way. They very much are aligned with us in the department on law of war. They are very much aligned with the department on management and how you manage collateral damage and how you assess it and how you calculate it, and et cetera. Those things, quite frankly, are moving along very well. So my sense is we're on a good trajectory. We're slow to the game. There are those who say, and I saw an article this morning in the paper by someone who I do respect and admire, saying, gee, you know, should we have gone down this path? You know, do we as a nation want to do this and use this as a weapon? You know, what's inside Pandora's box when you open it? My problem with that is it's very difficult to uninvent these things. We may make a conscious decision as a nation that we don't want to do something, okay? But we generally do that in light of other capabilities that replace. So as we move away from area weapons and area denial weapons, which has been the trend that we've been on for about the last 5 to 10 years, precision allowed us to come back into that game in a way that was actually much more effective. If we decide we want to move away from cyber or offensive cyber, for whatever reason and justification, we're going to have to find something else because strategic depth is a big problem for us. The leverage that we get from things that move at the speed of light, and you know, I kind of got out of the box a little bit, which is first time ever, but when I was at Stratcom, it said I only want things that are either Mach 20 or speed of light. I don't really want to go below that. I mean, that's where, in my sense, that's where we're heading. You know, and we've done some test flying at Mach 20. That's pretty interesting. You can make LA from here in about 9.5 minutes. You know, and that hypersonic type activity is going to be part of what it will help us take away mobility from adversaries. But that is where we're going. We're not going to uninvent that stuff. And giving more tools to the National Command Authority to conduct diplomacy and support diplomacy is really what we're about, okay? And like I said, I'm willing to go in any direction. That's the history of cyber according to Cartwright. You can take it or leave it. But that was the thought process that went into much of what we have done thus far. And I appreciate it. Thank you.
We have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. We have microphones arrayed at the top, but if you want to just stand and deliver loudly and clearly, we'll take that too.
Oh, sorry. I've been asked that one in conjunction with how do you do BDA, how do you know what happened out there, those kinds of things. Hypothetical, because I'm not in the military, I don't know secrets anymore, those kinds of things. Let's make you a Patriot battery. And your target's 1,000 miles away, coming in at a very high rate of speed. How do you know? Well, your radar detected it. Okay. How do you know that anything happens to it and it drives off of its target? Your radar tells you that it drove off its target. How do you know that you aren't turning off all of the electric toilets in the country? Well, you only work for a certain capability, a certain aperture. So from my perspective, there are ways to do and close the command and control BDA loops and do them very effectively. Those are the things that, and that's why we want to try to do this in the construct of fires, because then I can take advantage and I can move between kinetic and non-kinetic at will, based on the scenario, based on the need, and based on the desired effect. And so if shoot looks like kinetic, non-kinetic, or non-kinetic, and then kinetic if needed, with radar or some other sensor telling you exactly what has happened, you have a fundamentally different way of approaching the problem that is really the same as you've always done it in the past. You've just incorporated non-kinetic, very high-speed fires, which can be very effective in that particular case in the ascent phase, which is where weapons are most vulnerable. So, you know, this capability has to be integrated. That was the problem, and that's a lot of the problem. And so if you try to take it into the wired world and the theft of intellectual capital and moving around that way, you run into the problems that you just illustrated. Now, we've worked our way through how to manage and are working our way through how to manage collateral damage and specificity and precision fires. But at the end of the day, you want to integrate this with your kinetic fires if at all possible, number one. And then number two, you want the same systems that would do BDA for you to be able to do BDA for cyber effects. That's the way I think about it. Okay. Yes, sir. Yeah. Because of these fast cycle times, you know, you are seeing the services also start to move towards capabilities that are agnostic to the platform, okay? So the platform is there to give you an attribute of maneuver that you desire, okay? It may be, in today's world, we look for the attribute of persistence. We look at the attribute of speed, etc. The platform's designed to give you that attribute. What it carries and what it functions should be separate and should be accommodated by being able to be moved to whatever platform attribute you want. So if you want a fast airplane, I can hang the sensors and the processing capabilities on that. If you want a stationary ground capability, you can do that. That allows us to move things around and allows us to break out of the industrial cycle and separate it and create a Moore's Law cycle that is much more appropriate for the activities that we have. What we have worked hard on, we've made that the department has made that separation in requirements. They're now working on making that separation in acquisition, and then the next piece that has to follow is the Congress, in our interaction with the Congress in the budget cycle, has to be able to accommodate those kinds of activities. Thus far, we've really gotten no pushback because explaining that to people makes it very clear. It's been helpful. If war can be helpful, it's been helpful to be in these conflicts, okay? Because we had the ability of uncoloring money in order to use it in this fashion. In other words, give me a pot of money and I can color it any direction and make it live for 2 or 3 years, and that allows you to do that kind of work. And so we are finding tolerance. We still work up against a demographic of, I'm tired of buying all these computers for your desks. That's really not what this is about. We've got to find a way to articulate weapon system versus administrative support, and it's hard to separate those things. And we're still working at that, but that's the path that we're on. Sir?
Last week, Secretary Panetta had some remarks to be made in New York and emphasized, I think, in a fresh way, issues associated with the threat coming from the cyber domain, and I thought maybe you might reflect a little bit, perhaps perspective on that for us.
Sure. I think, for the most part, the Secretary had 2 missions. You know, there are an awful lot of people out that are either, for whatever motivation, you know, turning the data associated with cyber attacks on the United States into large numbers, et cetera, in ways that are hard to understand. Okay, I've been attacked 1 million times last week. Well, that's because it just sits there and constantly pings on you, and there's really nothing to make it go away. But what is the downside of that? Most of what we see in cyber, and I think this is where we're starting to drift a little bit, up until now, most of what you deal with in cyber is really either nuisance or a legal issue. You're either stealing something like intellectual capital, or you're defacing or denying service, et cetera. All of those things tend to be in the legal forum and ought to be treated in the criminal forum. When you start to get to national secrets and things like that, now you're starting to get into a different way. That's why it's very important, in the taxonomy in this country has always been, take those things that can be handled by law enforcement, put them here, and let law enforcement handle that, and then create systems that are very clearly and widely separated from that require nation-state investment and intellectual capital in order to describe what it would be like in warfare. So I wouldn't expect the officer on the beat to be able to handle a formation of tanks, okay? We've got to do the same in cyber, and that's what we're trying to do in this layered defense approach is that which exists in .com is, needs to be protected. That needs to be partially your investment, maybe to some extent regulatory on the part of the government. But what happens and what is clearly war must be clearly separated from that and very visible and understandable to everybody. You can't do that until you architect the networks in such a way that it's clear that if you're going to go to, let's just say, DOD's networks and get into those networks, you've demonstrated intent, you don't belong there by law, and therefore you are an adversary. Fundamentally different. And separate the two. And we're working through that in legislation. We're starting to work through that in physical architectures. But you have to make that clear so that it is clear who's a bad guy and who isn't so that you can take appropriate action. We're getting much better now at attribution because we're re-architecting the networks in ways that allow us to do that. And I'm sure people up here can start to address that. But that's point one. Point two is that what he's starting to worry about is the distance between what is nuisance and criminal starting to look more and more like war. Okay? The last time I was in this room, it was with my counterparts from China about 3 months ago, and we were here to talk about cyber. Okay? And it was a very interesting conversation. Okay? They see it very different than we do. China's the only country in the world right now that wants no governance over cyber activities. Russia is at the other absolute extreme, wants to immediately go to treaty foundations. And the international community is somewhere in between. And we're going to have to work our way through that. It doesn't mean, if China doesn't want it, they aren't going to sign up. Okay? They'll work to a different drummer. But then we have tools to help us move both in a deterrence construct and in a compellence construct that may be able to, over time, move us to a point that's closer and workable. But I think these are the things that Secretary Panetta, through his words, was trying to put on the table, and to make people aware that the department is looking at that. We don't protect internal networks in the United States. We can be asked to assist through defense support to civil authorities, but we don't defend networks in the United States. We don't defend critical infrastructure in the United States. We are an away game. Our authorities are away. And what we're trying to do is instrument the networks around the world so we understand what's happening out there, characterize that instrumentation, and inside our capabilities of effects, create effects that would, in fact, convince somebody that it's just not a good idea to come and do that here.
We have time for one more.
Sir?
Sir, I work in a government agency. I work in a classified area.
Yeah.
And we're setting up our classified network. And in came a modem that we're going to hook up. And what we did is we looked and we saw it was made by an American company. We thought, this is good. We turned it over and we found out that everything about it said that it was made in another country.
Mm-hmm.
How much of a problem is it that most of the stuff we're using to build our hardware
Yeah. At least from my perspective, and this is a DoD type perspective or a national security type perspective too, is that you should always assume, no matter what you think you know about your network, that your network has been compromised. To do less is probably putting your head in the sand to some extent. Now, having said that, there are supply chain vectors that you can work and raise the price. In other words, if you're going to come in, so you can go through various protocols to assure that you've got the best that you could get, okay? There are activities that you can do and architectures that you can now start to build that can clean, reset, reboot, protect. Nothing's perfect, but do better for the software that might be coming in or the viruses, et cetera. Defense in depth on your wires and your network areas, whether they be closed or open. And then there are all sorts of offensive type things that you can do. And when I say offensive, I'm not talking about going out and attacking somebody. What I'm saying here is that, let's just take a simple one. You have an airplane and you want to shoot a missile and hit a target on the ground, okay? And all through that environment are networks and data links that are moving back and forth that could be hijacked, components internal that could have been bad when they were bought, all of those types of things, okay? One of the very easy things that you can do is run 2 fire control loops at the same time and compare them, okay? And then look for ground truth in that comparison. Those are things that are relatively straightforward and easy to do. That's just one technique. You can separate the physical world and the virtual world. We do that a lot in several high-value type activities so that they do not touch. Doesn't mean that it's perfect, but the likelihood of doing it takes me back again to this question, which is, okay, now if I find you in there, you're a bad guy. I don't really have to go characterize you at all. You're showing intent to do something bad. And so there are several techniques, and they're growing quite quickly as we start to move to the offensive side because it starts to show us how you can survive and be resilient through that. But you should always assume that your networks are under attack. That's been true since the advent of wire. And so that's the thought process. But we've got to get into that, and we have basically, through cost-saving mindsets, engineered a lot of that resilience out of our systems. We've got to get it back in. There will be some activity that says we must do foundry work inside the United States in order to do certain things. We have to be able to do that, and we have to be able to maintain the intellectual capital in this country to be able to do that. I appreciate the opportunity, and I really do applaud the fact that you're here and doing this, both from the standpoint of the Institute, but also from the standpoint of furthering and understanding kind of where we're going in this venue, because it is in fact the venue of the future of, quite frankly, probably of warfare and many other things. Thank you.
Sir, please accept this book from us at the Naval Institute, From Baghdad to Kabul and Back. We appreciate your insights as always and your time, your most precious commodity.
Thank you.